What does one learn from translating poetry for one's own poetry? Why are there so many great poets interested in translation? How does poetry evolve out of translation? And in what way is the process of translation the perfect training ground for writing? Translation, especially of poetry, is not the merely supposedly possible literal translation, but a new creative act, the creation of a linguistic network that does justice to the profound dimensions of the text and gives it the status of an independent literary work. In other words, translation is not about transferring the lexicon, it is genuine poetic writing, perhaps best understood metaphorically as a kind of rewriting, as a second creation with a clear basis. Because the difference between writing a poem and translating a poem, at least for me, is the starting point. The first blank page when writing, the fact of the poem when translating before the second blank page. Examples, especially of multilingual blended levels of translation and poetry, can be found in the works of my three interview partners, American poet and translator Mary Jo Bang, Belarusian poet and translator Volha Hapeyeva, and German translator Uda Strätling.
So far, I have been translated into 15 languages or so.
It might be easier in other languages, but German does not easily lend itself to this kind of, we don't have as many one-syllable words.
You know, one of the examples was to put Eric Cartman, the character from South Park, into the level of hell.
For me, dialogues and correspondences between poets who have been translating each other also belong to these extensions of the concepts of translation, another kind of afterlife of the original in Walter Benjamin's sense. The network of literature is actually always full of translation. It is one of the truly groundbreaking moments of hospitality in a globalized, yet still fragmented and often hostile world. So let us be in dialogue with three masterful poets and translators in the order of their appearance: Mary Jo Bang, Volha Hapeyeva, and Uda Strätling. So Mary Jo, welcome again to this session on translation. As a poet and translator, what brought you to translation in the first place?
After taking a class in translation, a workshop at Columbia University when I was working on my MFA, and that was in the late 90s, well, mid-90s, really. And after that, I read translations with much more knowledge and appreciation that there was something added by the translator. There was that no two translations would be alike. And I think that naively, before that, I was like a lot of people, just thinking that you plug in one word for another and that most people would come up with the same word. And it wasn't until 2005 that I actually went back to translation and began translating really just the first 3 lines of Dante's Inferno.
The form of the 3 books of Dante's masterpiece is kind of like, I think, pretty stable in a way. One of your strategies in translating those wonderful books is also to put in contemporary references, to kind of like dig deep into pop culture, songs, to play with lines which for an American reader might be really interesting, and it will bring a smile to our faces. That's a very bold strategy. How did you come by that?
Well, first of all, I wanted people to be able to read it, but then I wanted people to want to read it. And so my idea was to occasionally, but not too often, to insert, and again, when it met the translation exactly or very close, something of the current era. And You know, one of the examples was to put Eric Cartman, the character from South Park, into the level of hell committed for the gluttonous. And that was always my aim, to try to make that perfect fit so that it truly is translation, but that the mirror held up to the reader is one in which they see themselves today, instead of feeling like this is some quaint literary artifact where they're reading about, you know, things that happened in the past.
So translation is a form of bringing works from different time spans and different cultures into the space of American culture, in your case, American language, American literature, and make them contemporary. Is that kind of like what your stance would be as a translator and as a poet?
Certainly with Dante's Inferno and Purgatorio, and now Paradiso, which I'm just finishing up. My decision to do that was based on that particular text and the fact that we already have many, you know, previous translations that might adhere more closely, word for word, to the original. But I don't know that that's my general approach to translation. I'm really a very I'm really committed to maintaining the relationship between the original and the translation. But again, if it's a poem, I think it's a juggling act where sometimes you're elevating the need to have sound, and then other times you're elevating the need to have readability, you know, accessibility. And some things don't translate. You know, there are idioms, there are jokes, there are puns that can't be replicated in the original word that's being used.
Since I had the pleasure to also work with you directly on a book of mine, my first collection of poems, Loops, which you translated really geniusly into English, and you changed the title of the collection, because loops is one of those puns which works in the German language quite well, because it's an imported English word with a double O, you know, as if the word is looking at you, and it's connected to all my other poetry titles, pools, tools, and spools, which are also kind of like immigrant expressions from English to certain in certain times. You selected a title stemming from one of the poems in the collection, Colonies of Paradise. How important was that change of title, and how did this decision to kind of like make this a title also maybe inform your translation or your last version of the translation of my poems?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said before, wanting to make a reader want to read the book, which is no small thing. People often have a resistance to poems. They think that they don't understand them, or that they're trivial compared to nonfiction, you know, the front page of the New York Times. There's an urgency. So you want to lure the reader to the work. And as an English title, Loops, I felt didn't really give the reader access to what they were going to encounter, and perhaps wouldn't have a sense of suspense. Whereas Colonies of Paradise, I mean, who doesn't want to know about paradise? And particularly the oddity of colonies, because a colony is outside of something. You know, it comes from the Roman word, which was devised to describe those farmlands outside the main city, often worked by people who were, you know, taken over by the armies, or sometimes the armies themselves, but they were feeders into the, you know, the main city, like Rome. I felt like it was an exciting title. It was the title of one of your poems. And the fact is that as we talked while we were doing the translations, working on them together very closely, that these 4 different cities that you know, divide the book into 4 sections: Chicago, Paris, Moscow and Hamburg. I believe it's Hamburg, right? The German city.
Yeah.
So those are places where the speaker of all the poems is trying to find a paradise, but can only find a colony of it. And so that it seemed quite perfect in the description of what was going to be inside the book, as well as a kind of teaser, like come and see what a colony of paradise might look like.
What does it give you back as a poet to work as a translator so intensively with texts?
Well, for me, it's a game. And for me, poetry is a game, which is not to say it's not a very serious game, but it's a word game. Your work has a lot of humor that's embedded in the language. So it's not a broad kind of humor that is available on the surface, but it's only when you read carefully and you see what language is doing, then you appreciate the poetic intelligence and the psychological richness. So those things go hand in hand. A poet who is aware of how language works will be able to do that in a way that other people can't do. And that's part of the pleasure of being a poetry reader, is encountering that exact kind of dynamic where someone has embedded not only meaning and multiple meanings, but also levels of psychological richness. And you do that, which of course for a translator makes it even more difficult, but more satisfying when you're able to find a solution to something like that title.
Not that I want to kind of like prey on the small literature part or small language part, because literature is always as great as it is by the impact it has on its readers. But there's a difference to become a world famous poet like you became. You cannot only rely on the poems written by yourself in your own language. Translation is a big part of that. How does your poetry travel through translation?
I want to hope that its travel is quite safe and light and pleasant. So far, I have been translated into 15 languages or so, and for me, it always has been such a great honor if somebody decided to translate my poetry into their own language. And I think in most of the cases, I always tried to be there and was happy to be there, and suggested or offered translators my help if they needed, and was happy then to read the results if I could. Yeah, or at least just to look how it looks, if it was the language which I don't understand at all or or speak at all.
You speak a lot of languages yourself. Amongst those languages are German, English, Japanese, and many others. Japanese, as being a linguist, is still a reach.
Yeah, I want to interrupt you a little bit and say that to speak a language is one thing, and to translate from the language is another. And that's why I would say that I speak Japanese or Chinese. I mean, these are my, so to say, languages for pleasure, especially Japanese, which I use when I want to translate Japanese poetry. Yeah, but I'm not an active speaker, so to say. But I can translate, maybe we talk about it later then.
I think we can kind of like delve right into your desire to translate the poems of Kobayashi Isa, which you selected for for translation into Belarusian, and which you are now preparing also for a German audience since you immigrated, and also started to write in German very successfully. So essays, poems, and now you also work as a translator of this book, which you previously translated into Belarusian. What attracted you to the poetry of Kobayashi Isa, and what were the traits of and interesting problems of translating him?
Thank you for mentioning this book, and I have maybe one and the last copy of yeah, it's here. It's very nice book, not because I did it, but because it's really so, and it has also we included the pictures from the Edo period artists, so the period during which Kobayashi Isa lived. And for me, his poetry is maybe why I cherish it so much is because of his empathy to little creatures. And this is so beautiful and so heart and soul touching. When you read a haiku about a louse or about a little fly, how she wraps her little yeah, what do you call it in English? Ants, horse. Yeah. That's, for me, it's just like out of space. And although, I mean, if you read the biography of Kobayashi Isa, you will see how unlucky actually he was in his life, and what hard life he had. Really, like, not a lucky person. But still, I mean, he didn't turn into this grumpy, pathetic poet, you know, but managed to keep up this lightness and sympathy to others who are maybe also not lucky in this life. And maybe because of this, he really felt these relationships to those who were deprived of I don't know, beautiful, lucky lot, and that's why it made him or it made possible for him to tell us about the sufferings, but also the beauty of the life of little creatures. So this is the haiku about the lipstick and the snow, and I will read it in Belarusian. Maybe somebody will watch us who knows Belarusian. Spodок с помадой, сыплется снег, червень на доньце. In English, in rough translation, that would be something has also with a lipstick, but I use the word pomade, which is more like ointment here. I mean, but the word pomade in Belarusian is like lipstick. I mean, like, or it has a broader meaning in Belarusian than in English, let's say. Yeah. Then the snow is falling down. The red thing on the bottom, and here then this long text which I wrote is the explanation about the differences of the lipsticks and how it looked, because in Edo period, beni, so this is the name for the lipstick in Japanese, it was not like a stick lipstick. It was like a pomade in a saucer. And when it's and it's dry, I mean, it's just like And it has, if it's a good quality one, it has greenish color when it's dry. So when the snow falls, or when, I mean, if you wanted to put it on your lips, you have to use the finger or some little brush, and then with the water to do, and then it will become red. And depending on the amount of wetness or water, it will also have different tones. And sure, I mean, for me, it was important also to explain this thing, not because like only to show, oh, we had different types of lipsticks during that time, but also because of the image which you have when you read it. Yeah, because if you think about European, I mean, nowadays, lipsticks, it's already red. I mean, and if snow falls on it, nothing actually changes. Nothing happens. But if you think about that old fashioned lipstick in a saucer, which is originally or looks like green, and then when the snow falls or snowflake, it turns red, and it's wow. I mean, it's a new image. It's a completely different picture, which you can imagine in your heart.
This is a brilliant illustration for how a cultural background and research informs your translational practice. Do you think that we need the same kind of like research and knowledge and knowledgeability to understand poetry in general? So should we kind of like learn more about the subject matters of what is said to us into language?
I really think for you as a reader, it's up to you. But yeah, if you teach poetry or if you translate poetry, yeah, then I think that would be nice of you to read or to dig up into the biography of the author, possibilities, or no, better say, why or when this poem appeared, what were the consequences for that. But again, it's also not always possible. So
in one of your recent books, many of your works, as I mentioned, have been translated. Recently, a lot of them have been translated into German. And I was really honored to also help to translate some of your works into the German language. One was the collection Trapezherz, which just came out with Droschel, which is a very beautiful book of your poems. And you helped me tremendously working with me on the originals, and then helping me to finding really good solutions for the German poems. Another one will come out very soon, which is a novel, and your second novel. This novel actually smuggles in a Belarusian word into the German literary context, because it's titled can you remind us, Samota, which means loneliness. The whole title is Samota oder die Einsamkeit über den Flug.
Wohnte im Zimmer gegenüber.
Yeah.
Also lived in the room next, loneliness next door, maybe in English. Very compact language. So
yeah, Samota, loneliness next door. Yeah,
something like this.
The loneliness lived next door, or a loneliness next door. But this is a wonderful act to have Samota as a Belarusian word pop up in international contexts. Is this migration of words, is that also something interesting for you as a linguist, as a translator, and as a poet?
Yeah, I think very much. I have another example. In my earlier poem, I have German word Straße, which I use like счастье раздавали на некой там Straße. So happiness was handed over on some Straße, yeah, the street, and the thing is, like, I mean, the word Straße is not an active word in Belarusian language, although we do have lots of Germanisms in Belarusian. But just because I think of certain historical context, lots of Belarusian know a couple of more German words because of the Second World War, and the word Straße belongs to this types of words. So I mean, everybody understands in Belarusian but I mean, you also feel that it's a strange word. I mean, at the same time, but yeah, you're right. I like it because maybe as a linguist, I try also this place and dragging, and there is another poem which I built on using the languages which I learned or tried to learn, and took the original phrases from those manuals. Yeah, like Agathe va à la gare, elle a mal à la tête, which is a real phrase from the book. So Agathe goes to the railway station. She has a headache. Yeah, and that actually was I think of maybe a debate for us with you when we were translating or working on that poem, and we were thinking what to do in the German text with the German lines, which I have in Belarusian. Yeah, Paul ist faul und Peter ist fleißig. And so you decided to leave it as it is. Yeah, I'm still thinking about it.
I should have translated this, or we should have translated it back into Belarusian to have Belarusian lines in there, maybe. But I was just so much in love with the actual meaning of this. Paul ist faul und Peter ist fleißig, because it's nearly the structure of a children's poem in itself, and it is so cool, you know, and it brings back and reminds, I think, all of your German readers to how we learned how to read, because these are the kind of like phrases which were in our textbooks when we started reading.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I mean, according to how the audience reacts during the readings this year, it reacts very well. So that's why thank you very much for doing this work. And I mean, you said a couple of points that's not true. You made the whole book, so, and you have to accept it and take the responsibility. Thank you very much.
So language and a poem can be likened to a code. You also have a poem about a code, and it reminds me of a very famous Slovenian poem by Kosovel, The Little Code, where, you know, this little code is like the sign of identity in a sense as well. But you are kind of like also bringing to mind that a poem in general can kind of like have that function, and it is not necessarily only refined to it's the original language it was written in. Translation is offering this to everyone in the world in a sense, and that might be really up to your aesthetics of offering your poems and offering poems and translations, which you did, to make them accessible to readers, to kind of like really feel secure, more curious, and more connected with the world. Would that be a nice statement to make on your own way of translating and writing, or is it too much?
Yeah. No, I think that's fine. And yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you've said, that translation enriches your own language. It's definitely sure. That's why I also think this is so important to translate into Belarusian. Yeah, because this is the language of my first language of creation, or of writing mother tongue.
One of your translation projects you kind of like worked through your whole life basically was Emily Dickinson's letters and the included poems in the letters. why this fascination with Dickinson and why this fascination with translating her? Because I imagine this is one of the hardest things you ever did.
Definitely, because you always have a problem in poetry that you have such a density of space where there's so much happening that it's difficult to sort of cover everything in equal measure. But Dickinson is the absolute extreme because her poems are very short, very dense, and highly, they're loaded. They're loaded with meaning. They're loaded with complicated analytical considerations. And it's just a huge challenge. I mean, and it's fun. It's also an ordeal, if you will. And it's impossible to achieve. It might be easier in other languages, but German does not easily lend itself to this kind of, we don't have as many one-syllable words. And Emily Dickinson uses tons of one-syllable words. I have the same thing in a way, with Mary Jo Bang. And I do believe there are similarities in the sense that with Mary Jo Bang's poetry, you'll also find this sort of very keen analytical mind and a penchant for very powerful, I don't know whether you metaphor, imagery, semantics, basically. They can sort of, one word can blow up in your face. I mean, and this is sort of typical Dickinson, and I do find it in Mary Jo Bang's poems as well.
So Mary Jo Bang's A Doll for Throwing is your current project, and which I'm really happy to collaborate with you. Again, we did Elegy, translated Elegy, Mary Jo Bang's seminal work on grief, I would say, which also showed this condensed electricity of words. Emily Dickinson's phrase for that is naked voltage. It's kind of like this this current
That's what Ted Hughes said of her poetry. Yeah.
So this current running through the work, which kind of like electrifies everything around it. And if we want to kind of like talk a little bit about Mary Jo Bang's project, kind of like, how did you perceive A Doll for Throwing? We met her here in St. Louis. She gave you this book, and it's a book. Could you maybe kind of like talk a little bit about how you read it and how you approached translating it?
Yes, well, at first I had no idea what it was about, because the English title obviously doesn't trigger the same sort of associations or connotations that you would have in German, because and that will be a problem for us when sort of deciding on a title for the German version, because Wolfspuppe, the doll that Alma Buschasidov created at the Bauhaus, this sort of floppy knitted doll or crocheted, or I don't know exactly, with a wooden head that would sort of fall gracefully wherever you threw it. I didn't realize that was what was behind this title. A Doll for Throwing, to me at first just sounded very strange, but that makes you curious, obviously. And then if you open the book, it begins with a sort of, we'd encountered this with Max Porter. You have an empty frame. I don't know if you can see this. And it's left to your imagination what's going on in there. And then it's followed by poems, prose poems that are unusual in that they are justified texts. So you have the lines running over basically the line break, but within a fixed border. So you have this sort of this paradox of fixed borders with everything else inside being in motion. And again, going from English to German, you're hard at work trying to sort of, because I felt that despite the clean edges, you still have lines, and you still have the line breaks that are meant to sort of that come with a surprise. I mean, to me, the obvious line in The Head of a Dancer is one of the very first ones. How does it go? Hang on. Let me just read this. The days when you lean your head forward, then pull your head back to see the sun is, and then you have the break, basically, is only a chrysanthemum. You know, you think, what is this? So it's a very fascinating constraint that she has sort of chosen to enact. How would you say? I mean, she writes somewhere that what she liked about the doll for throwing is, for one thing, the way it falls gracefully, and one could say that of her main figure, character, the character she's interested in mostly is Lucia Moholy-Nagy, or Moholy, whom she says, despite being thrown in a lot of ways, she was Jewish, she had to flee Germany, she lost her glass negatives, she wasn't recognized for the work she'd done at the Bauhaus, that she went on to do some very productive, some very important work. That's one thing. Then Mary Jo Bang also says, interesting to her was the fact that throwing is what a ventriloquist does with his or her voice. And so the doll for throwing is an apt metaphor for these poems, for poetry in general, for the way Mary Jo sort of enacts voices. She, interestingly enough, she's added a disclaimer to the book, quoting that very famous line of Emily Dickinson's that she'd sent to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, was it? Where is it? Saying, where is it? I'm sorry. Here we are. When I state myself as the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person.
So if the author or the voice who writes a poem, an hermetic poem, like in Mary Jo's case, is witnessing something which only she can witness in the act of creation, in the act of writing, the role of the translator then is to witness this in the original and to read about it and to do a lot of research about it in order to recreate this witnessing situation of the process of the creation act itself with all its knowledge behind the stories behind the story, so to speak, the details behind the story, but also to leave open exactly this kind of like insecurity and this openness in order to make it a poem. The multiple layers, and that kind of like leads me to maybe our conclusive question. Thank you so much for this talk. It was very enlightening in many ways. The English Romantic poet Percy Shelley once remarked that poets are the unsung or unacknowledged legislators of the world. What are translators then?
Who was it that said? I think it was Max Herter who said, "Out of translation will travel." You know, it's the only way, because not all of us speak so many languages that we could read the sort of most important work in the original. So
I think they are the NGOs, trying to kind of like enrich the world on a not too intrusive level of this idea of universalism, which you just like created as an idea. And since literature is so based in language, without the translators, texts cannot travel, poetry cannot travel, and human experience can't travel. And so the travel, maybe translators are part of a travel agency, a universal travel agency. I like that idea a lot. And to kind of like round it off with a quote from Wittgenstein, who famously started his Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus with "Die Grenzen meiner Sprache sind die Grenzen meiner Welt." The borders of my language are the borders of my world. This kind of like ties in, I think, quite heavily into poetry and into translation, because translation then means that we are crossing borders and that we try to help to smuggle experiences and great work from one country into the other, in order to kind of like erase the notion maybe even of frames, borders, countries. And that is a very, very beautiful thing to say about translation, because that makes us the universal hosts of poetical experience. So as you can see, we rather just scratched the surface of what it means to translate and to be translated, what it means for myself as a poet and translator to work on translation. Thank you so much for watching us. I really hope you get inspired to find texts you want to translate into your language, and get inspired to collaborate with translators to get your own poetry translated, because poetry travels only in translation.